Hey, welcome to episode, I think 5 of Lone Star Legacy. Maybe it's 6. Um, yeah, this is the podcast of the Lone Star Lurgoyfs out of Texas. I'm Stu. You've heard my voice a number of times on this cast by now. Tonight, or really this afternoon, it's only 3:30 here. I'm drinking a Cole beer, which is a Kolsch by South Austin Brewery. They're in Austin brewery I've not ever had before, but I saw this at the store and decided to give it a shot. Tonight I have Patrick Brennan and Ben Kendrick on with me if they want to say hi.
Yeah, hello.
Good.
Patrick Brennan. So yeah, here to talk about some of the vintage ban and restriction updates. Got with me so as we'll probably talk about a little bit, Texas is going through especially Houston, a bit of a flooding catastrophe with Harvey right now. So actually went out and did a little preemptive shopping. Brash Brewery got some crowlers of Abide and a few of their other beers. So I'll be drinking Abide in my commemorative Black Lotus mug as we discuss some of the ban and restricted lists. So I thought it was appropriate.
Yeah, Brash Brewery, alternate home of the Lone Star Lurgoyfs.
Yes.
And I'll say, as a big fan of stouts, I will say that Abide is possibly the best beer ever. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, the last vintage tournament we had, I was going to have 1 or 2 beers, and then I had an Abide, and then I made it 4 Abides, and I was like hammered drunk by the last round. But anyway, I'm Ben Kendrick. Heard me on here before, and I'm normally out of Houston, but my neighborhood in Sugar Land, Texas got evacuated due to Hurricane Harvey flooding, so I am down at a friend's place in Corpus Christi right now. Seems a little backwards since the hurricane initially hit Corpus, and everyone was worried about Corpus, but now that it's flooding the shit out of Houston, and Corpus looks fine, looks like nothing happened here. So
Yeah, that's so crazy to me. It's right on the water, right?
yeah, I mean, they got the winds and stuff, and they probably got some storm surge and everything, but in terms of like flooding and whatnot, it's fine. There's like a few leaning palm trees. I saw a fence down and a sign for some businesses and stuff blown through, but it's not horrifying damage or anything.
Right. I don't think it's like Rockport and Victoria where they got hit really hard.
Driving down here from Houston, we went through, Victoria, Refugio, stuff like that that's in between here, and they got hammered. I felt horrible for those people. It looked like a tornado went through, but just the whole town, not like, a little band from a tornado.
Yeah, it was crazy.
For sure.
Ben and I were talking before you got on the call, Patrick, and I was just saying that Austin, we got rain, like heavy rain and fairly high winds all through the weekend, but you wouldn't, like, driving around now, think anything could really happen. There's some, like, down trees, but really not much going on here.
Yeah, so I'm pretty much stuck in my neighborhood. We're good here. We didn't flood, but all around us, the bayous have come up, and so we can't get anywhere beyond kind of like the close few blocks around us. But luckily, there's grocery stores and stuff that are open right now. So I think we'll be fine moving forward, and it's just kind of going to be what's going on around us, and then eventually what we can do to help with cleanup and things like that. So
power hasn't gone out or anything yet, right?
No, we've been good, and I actually just got an email from Centerpoint Energy, and they said they're back up to having like 95% of people with power. So it's still, probably a couple
Yeah.
back up quick.
That's crazy. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, I guess like Houston is the center of like power and oil and everything. So I guess if anyone was gonna like stay online, it would be you guys. But
yeah. My girlfriend pointed out earlier that one thing Houston has going for it is a whole bunch of very large oil companies who are heavily invested in Houston continuing to run. So
Yeah,
that oil money.
you have that and Joel Osteen, right? He's been having some fun times the past few days.
And Donald Trump's on his way down to Corpus Christi. I'm sure he's going to save the day.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's what's going on. We are dedicated podcasters and Magic aficionados who, despite the weather emergency in Houston, wanted to talk about the banned and restricted announcement that happened yesterday on the 28th. So the three of us are on here to talk about that. Our usual co-host, Sam Craven, is missing because he might be getting evacuated, right?
He's not literally missing.
He's not literally. We're well aware that he's alive.
Whereabouts are known.
He's in one of the potential flood zones for the Addicks Reservoir, so he's probably relocating this afternoon. But he's safe and sound so far, along with all the rest of the goifs. So that's been one of the good positive things out of this.
Yeah, it's funny in our group chat we have going, like, everyone's reaction. It's always like, "Oh, is everyone okay?" Follow-up question: are your cards okay?
Yeah.
Priorities, man. Priorities.
I know. Patrick Vincent was out of town this past weekend, so he asked me to go check on his house, and it was like insane. His ceiling caved in, but he was first priority was just like, okay, my Black Lotus is sitting in a binder on the floor. Please move it to higher ground.
You know, we joke, but it's serious. If my house goes away, I'm going to be very, very happy that I took a giant pile of expensive collectibles.
Yeah. It was fun. It's like hard explaining that to anyone else, though. Patrick was saying he was talking to his mom after, and he was like saying to her that he was so thankful his cards were okay, and she was like, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." So
yeah. If you lose some clothes in a bed or something, they're not too bad to replace. And you're going to replace them by selling your cards.
Yeah. So as we suggested, there was a ban and restricted announcement on Monday, and we want to talk about that. As a quick overview, nothing was changed in the majority of formats. So I think tonight is going to mostly focus on vintage. Patrick, you had the announcement pulled up, I think.
I do.
So, if you want to.
Yeah, so I've got it open, and I'm sure everyone knows now. But so the announcement is that Monastery Mentor is now restricted, along with Thorn of Amethyst, and then we have the unrestriction of Yawgmoth's Bargain. And I think we're kind of all in agreement that the DCI did a pretty amazing job at kind of going through some of their logic of how they went through and decided upon these restrictions and unrestrictions. So, it's really nice to kind of see their thought process and what they were looking at. They talked about with Mentor, especially, that essentially just it surfaced as the best win condition for blue decks. So you didn't have much variety at that point left. And so I think, wanting to see some more diversity in the blue strategies is probably one of the main things for going after Mentor. And just with how difficult it is to combat with, as they said, essentially it's difficult to combat and recover from due to the number of powerful 0 and 1 cost non-creature spells available in the format. So in an effort to weaken the Monastery Mentor strategies and allow for more diversity in win conditions, they've restricted it. So the next big one, I guess, is Thorn of Amethyst and the prevalence of it in essentially the workshop format. So Shops has been pretty dominant lately. We've seen it been doing really, really well in the online meta and in paper. So they go through the discussion of whether or not they wanted to hit Thorn or Sphere, and they were both essentially candidates for restriction in this case. But they ended up going after Thorn just because it's the more powerful, in their opinion, of the two sphere-based effects. Because you can essentially keep putting out the creature threats without hindering your own strategy. So unfortunately, that's probably going to provide a little bit of splash damage for some other decks in the format that were using Thorn. And then I guess they
acknowledged, right?
They did. So they said, where is it? So Thorn of Amethyst is the more powerful disruptive tool in the Shops deck and allows the deck to continue applying creature-based threats unimpeded. The case for restricting Sphere instead is to avoid splash damage on other archetypes. Other non-Shops creature decks also use Thorn. The big examples there would probably be White Eldrazi and Hate Bears.
And colorless Eldrazi.
Yeah, and colorless Eldrazi. So They say, though, however, given the strength of shops in the current metagame, they thought restricting the more impactful one, that being Thorn of Amethyst, was the right way to go. So we'll see how that shakes out. Hopefully it doesn't have too much impact on those other decks, but we'll talk about what that might look like a bit more. And then the last one is unrestricting Yawgmoth's Bargain. So they also talked about whether or not they were looking at Windfall as another potential unrestriction, but decided not to, essentially because of its heavy reliance on play versus draw, and it being a blue card, pitchable to force. So it's just that much better in blue decks. So we'll see what it looks like with moving forward with Yawgmoth's Bargain unrestricted, and we'll talk about that too.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that for us. And I think what we'd like to do tonight, I keep saying tonight because we usually do this cast at like 7 o'clock. What we want to do this afternoon instead of our jobs is walking through each of these changes step by step. Obviously, this is going to heavily focus on Vintage. Before we get specifically into all those cards, quickly we want to touch on the fact that nothing was changed in any other formats. No one on the call tonight ever plays Standard.
Yeah.
Likewise, I think I'm the only one who ever plays Modern with any regularity.
Yeah, I played on occasion. I would say with regularity. Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
And I mean, Modern seems to me anyway to be as healthy as it's ever been. So they'd be crazy to touch it right now.
Yeah, that's basically my takeaway. I really enjoy Modern whenever I show up to play it because it's got a huge array of decks that you can potentially run into. On the last episode that we did, none of the three of us were on that call, but we had a write-in question from a listener about the kind of increasing trend in a number of formats for people to call for bans. And I know that you guys probably pay less attention to forums like MTG Salvation than I do, but I'll say that that is so constant there, no matter what shape the meta is in. In a given week, if there's like a deck that's doing better than any others, people are like, oh, should X card be banned? It's like Death Shadow came out. Immediately people had to ask, should Death Shadow be banned? Eldrazi Tron started doing well. Everyone's like, oh, Temple's got to go.
Yeah.
And it's a frustrating trend. It's I don't know. It's annoying on a whole bunch of levels, but Modern currently seems to be in a state where it's able to kind of regulate itself. We've had these decks come out and do really well, but within, some number of weeks or months, an answer to it arises, its meta share falls, and everything kind of balances out.
Yeah.
So like Ben said, I think it would be a bit crazy or at least unnecessary to ban anything in Modern right now. In Legacy, the purpose of our last episode was talking about Deathrite Shaman and its kind of place in the format and whether or not we thought it should be banned. I think everyone on the call basically said, no, it's a really horribly designed card, but it shouldn't be banned.
Well, I think a lot of that was it shouldn't be banned yet, too. Where it's been like a few months. So, I mean, my best example on that is I remember about a year ago, people were calling for an Ayavugan ban in Legacy because Eldrazi was taking over the world and that was going to kill us all. And of course, a few months pass and Eldrazi's a tier 2 deck again. It's like we just had an absolutely massive shakeup with Sensei's Dividing Top going in April. And I mean, we shouldn't be too shocked that the meta's a little ugly for a bit. So I'm of the opinion that Deathrite is too powerful and that's probably not going to be fixed. So I think Deathrite is going to probably get banned eventually, but it would be insanely premature to hit it now.
Yeah, I think those are the really
what they do.
Right, really valid points. This kind of prevalence of attacking, high shares in the metagame with bannings and or restrictions it's kind of a scary trend. I don't think it's something we necessarily all want to see, especially in the slower moving formats, right? Mm-hmm. Legacy and Vintage, I think, are kind of the archetypes of that, where there's not as much information about it. There's a smaller player base online, and then a much smaller player base in paper. So we don't see things as much. And right now in Legacy, there's this dominance of kind of the Grixis and Grixis Delver, but this seems like the meta needs a bit of a chance to combat that, right? And actually attack those, whether it's from the mana base side or whatever. You know, I've been running Dragon Stompy and will continue to in Legacy. So, and I'm gonna do my part for Delver. But yeah, I think it's scary to see everyone calling for bans when I think, you know, this is a motto that Sam talks about it a lot is, you know, work on, you know, the change you want to see and try to adapt your decks to better fight the things you want to do. There's tons of availability in these formats and you can fight them. It's just people actually going out and doing that, not just jumping on the best decks and trying to precipitate the problem.
So, I mean, I wonder that if maybe it's not an actual increase in calling for bans, specifically talking about Legacy here, but more that, I mean, for years, it was the only conversation was, do they need to ban something out of Miracles? Do they need to ban something out of Miracles? And everyone pretty much just got tired of talking about it.
Right.
It's like, I don't know, maybe they will, maybe they won't. It doesn't matter. Legacy is what it is. It's been this way for a while. But now that that's been banned and it's kind of a new and exciting meta now there's different cards besides Sensei's Divining Top that we can talk about banning potentially. So now everyone's willing to discuss them.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting just in that I don't mean to be insensitive to anyone involved in this format, but for the most part, my guess would be that anyone playing formats like Legacy and Vintage in particular, probably not quite as true for Modern, but maybe have enough financial stability to be okay if there's a serious banning. Like, you know, we were talking about Deathrite on the last cast. For me, what that would mean if that got banned, specifically that impacts me playing Maverick. I'd have to go buy a playset of Noble Hierarchs and probably a couple Savannahs to round out and just play straight green-white, which like I can afford. What's that?
Yeah. You'd probably hit the ground running right after that.
Yeah. You know, I could afford to do it, and I think the deck would still be pretty solid without. But it's still frustrating to spend time putting a deck together, getting invested in your cards, like seeking out cards, whatever, and to have this kind of constant conversation going on in the backdrop of playing Magic of, you know, should this card exist and should your deck have to change? And that's just kind of like an unnecessary psychic pressure that I don't really enjoy having. I think it's, as I said, particularly prevalent in Modern, but it happens in Legacy. It's going on in Vintage. And it's not something that I love. That said, there are instances in which I think bans or restrictions really do have net positive payoff for a format. And I'll say that, you know, you guys, I imagine, agree. Maybe you don't. But this past announcement on Monday is a positive one. The changes that we saw in Vintage, I feel are going to be good for the format. And I think tonight we'd like to kind of dive into what we think about those.
Yeah.
So the first one that we want to talk about is Mentor. Mentor got restricted. It's the Mentor deck in Vintage is one of the two most dominant archetypes, and Mentor itself is one of the most powerful creatures we've probably ever seen in this format. Ben, I know you played Mentor to victory in our Goyf Invitational about a month or so ago. I've never played the deck. Patrick, have you played it before?
A few times online, but I don't actually think I've ever played it in paper.
Okay. Well, online is a thing, and you know, not to send us already down a kind of rabbit hole here, but an interesting discussion is when you look at bans and restrictions, I guess just restrictions in Vintage, the extent to which they come from the online meta.
I think it's a huge part of it, just because there's so few sanctioned Vintage tournaments. I mean, you got champs, and you got champs. You got Vintage champs, pretty much. Yeah, that's about it. Outside, I think there are some sanctioned tournaments that are ran kind of locally at different stores that tend to fire, but I don't think there's a huge prevalence of them.
Well, and Vintage is weird because you'll get the there's a big difference between your paper, your sanctioned paper, and your online meta, just due to the absolute cost of the cards. I mean, let's say if you're talking online, it's pretty easy to move the cards around. They aren't that expensive. If you're in paper and you have Dredge Bill, you have what, $3,500 put into that deck?
Yeah, easily.
If Dredge is in a bad place, you're probably just going to keep playing it unless you just have a crazy collection with all the vintage stuff. So
exactly,
you'll see people forcing kind of bad decks that aren't really great in the meta. So the meta is going to make itself look more diverse than it should.
Right.
And that's where you get the problem with there's only a limited number of Mishra's Workshops in existence. I mean, I think for an Antiquities Rare, it's something like 20,000 of them, 25,000, something like that. I mean, you don't know how many of those, got thrown away when mom cleared out a closet or.
Oh, let's hope not too many.
Yes, some are stuffed in collections somewhere. And when you see Vintage Champs and 600 people in the room, I think, right? So let's see. Imagine that half that room was playing Workshops. That's a significant percentage of every Mishra's Workshop ever printed is in that room.
Yeah, no, it is a huge portion of it.
You start hitting limits. You can't see that 50% shops meta at Vintage Champ because there's not enough freaking Mishra's Workshops out there.
No, it's very, very true.
So I think online is probably the best way to go if you want to talk balanced. What a truly free meta would look like.
Yeah, no, definitely. So getting a little bit back on track here. So let's talk about Mentor and what Mentor is going to mean moving forward. For, I guess, in some sense, we're talking about the blue archetype in general. We'd started to see a few blue decks, probably namely some big blue type decks, and Gifts Ungiven was starting to become a bit more popular. Just people who I think wanted to cantrip but didn't want to play Mentor. So
that's great.
Yeah, and I know within our meta we just didn't have Mentor present because no one wanted to play it. No one wanted to play against it. It just got stale. So we didn't see a whole lot of it. And I think there's a lot of people in the vintage community who are just tired of it, wanted to do something different. But now with the restriction, it's going to be a lot more interesting moving forward. So what's it going to look like? I mean, obviously, probably the main deck that we're talking about is the Jeskai Mentor builds with 3 or 4 Monastery Mentor, and then a lot of low mana cost, 0 to 2 mana cost spells to cantrip into Mentor and create an army of monks, both wide and tall. So where do we go from here?
I mean, there's so many different ways you can take that deck now. You can stay in the UWR colors and add some Young Pyromancers. I don't know if Young Pyromancer is powerful enough in that deck to really run people over like Mentor tokens would. But I'd imagine 1 Mentor and 4 Young Pyromancers could be enough of an engine.
Right. So
one thing that's staying in red there is Dak Faden is incredibly good in that deck.
Yes.
Especially Gush, and you have all the tutors for the Gush. So when you end up gushing and then dacking things away, it's great draw engine and splash shops hate, which is awesome.
Right. So the thing I immediately kind of thought of was, does this open up a little bit of space for some of the blue-red Delver decks that we were seeing, end of last year a little bit, and even before that, before Champs. And they would typically splash, maybe 1 or 2 Tundras, mainly for sideboard hate, because white opens you up to so much. So would a deck like that still jam a single Mentor and be viable in the current metagame?
Yeah, you'd probably think you'd want to go thin to blue-red there.
Right. So, but a lot of those decks, it's blue-red, and then you would have white just for sideboard splash, to get the Stony Silences, to get the Rest in Pieces, to have a Containment Priest in the sideboard. I mean, it opens you up to a lot of really good sideboard options.
Well, I guess there are probably much smarter men than me talking about vintage or any given format when you get abandoned restricted change or new printings, whatever. But an interesting thing is this close to a change happening in the format, our immediate reaction is to be like, the deck that got hit, what do we just obviously replace the hit cards with? Oh, let's just throw in some Pyromancers. Or you say, like, what can rise now? And you say, oh, Blue-Red Mentor or Blue-Red Delver. You know, that was a deck beforehand. It's really hard to actually have any sort of real foresight and predict these calls outside of these such like basic terms, though.
Sure.
Especially when the card is like Mentor. We'll talk about Thorn later. I think the correct response to the Thorn restriction is going to be, okay, what do you replace that with in the shop shell? Mm-hmm. When you talk Mentor, that's the power of the deck right there. It might just completely knock Mentor really out of the metagame entirely and get replaced by other blue decks. But
yeah, that's my thought as well.
But I think reasonably the first reaction is, can we save this deck? Because a lot of times when there's bannings and restrictions, people are going to try and save the deck. Look what's happening with Miracles and Legacy right now. Is that's coming back, and it's a legitimate deck.
Right. So can we save Mentor? I mean, can you save a blue-white shell of Mentor?
You know who can save it? Talrin Sky Summoner. He can save it.
Yes, Talrin's the best.
Yeah.
There you go.
With a moat. Slam some moats in there and Talrin's your ass right over the moat.
Yeah.
So the other interesting Mentor deck, well, there's a few more actually, is there was Esper versions that were coming out using Knight's Whisper, using the restricted black soup along with the blue.
Sure.
That deck, I'm not sure replaces it as well. Because I mean, you're not going to go to 4 colors to put a young Pyromancer in there and leave the black. It's just not. Doesn't seem right.
No, I don't
really know how that version can be saved.
I don't see that being where anyone really wants to be at that point. I think if you start going into black and blue, the gifts deck are just going to look so much better at that point. Kind of focusing on
the Tinker deck.
Yeah.
Especially if this drives down the huge meta share of the Mentor decks. There's a lot less Swords to Plowshares going around. That helps those Tinker decks quite a bit.
Yeah.
I remember Tinker Blightsteel used to be one of the best things you could be doing in the format. And
I think it's going to be
start. And then once everyone started running 3 Swords to Plowshares in their board, I haven't seen a Blightsteel Colossus in ages now.
Right, but I think we're about to see him quite a bit more now. I think Tinker is going to become a lot more prevalent, and it's going to be interesting. I mean, DAC is probably going to come around again as well, and people going more into red, blue and red outside of the white. So we'll probably have DAC coming back a bit again, as well as Tinker Blightsteel, perhaps due to less swords in the format. I mean, it's going to be interesting if we still get some blue-white type shells.
So one thing that I've been thinking about, and I think it's kind of interesting, is red has traditionally, for at least the last few years, been the color you want to be in to have good artifact hate. And the number one thing there is Ingot Chewer.
Right. And
the reason Ingot Chewer is so strong in Vintage is it's gets around Chalice the Void for 1 and Thorn of Amethyst.
Yes, it does.
So is Ingot Chewer really where you want to be for artifact destruction now?
As a quick side note, I'll say that I basically agree with you, although I'll say that access to DAC is also
access to DAC
strong when you think about red.
DAC's not nearly as good against Darkbound Ravager, though. That card has the Ravager shops builds have been able to fight DAC much more effectively.
Right. So
white with Fragmentize and Disenchant and things like Hataki might be actually more effective at hating out shops now.
Right, that's true. I mean, we might start seeing more things like Energy Flux as well to fight it a bit. So in red, you still got a Braid, you've got Ancient Grudge, you've got some options.
Ancient Grudge, that's a good point too.
Yeah, but hitting, I mean, Ingot Chewer does not seem as well positioned at this point when the 2 main things that it's getting around are both restricted at this point.
But when you think about the other big thing to my mind that red brings to the table is Pyroblast.
Sure.
So you have to kind of think about where non-shops decks are going to wind up in this meta. I mean, if what we see as shops is still just like some absurdly large percentage in the meta, then maybe you do drop the red and start looking to just white enchantment 8. But if maybe shops drops a bit and these mentor decks or whatever decks have to think about combating the other blue decks, then they're not going to be ditching their Pyroblast anytime soon.
Right, and additionally, the white's going to give you access to Stony Silence. I mean, there's a lot of really good things there, and then you get all this other great sideboard heat too, right? You get Containment Priest for anything like Oath or Dredge. I mean, you get a lot of really good access. Yeah, and Tinker. So it's going to be really interesting seeing how it evolves. I think we're gonna keep seeing Big Blue be a pretty prominent part of the blue meta, more so and more so. We're gonna see more mana drain, essentially. I think that's a good thing. It's kind of one of the pillars of the format that had been going by the wayside, with Mentor just dominating everything. So it's going to be nice to see that come back, and I think it's going to diversify from the more blue control decks, and then wherever a more kind of controlling to aggro kind of mid-range blue deck ends up. That one's going to be interesting.
So we'll talk about the last kind of version of Mentor, and this is the one that really convinced me that problem and needed to be the card restricted was the Storm versions of it. So we've been seeing just pure paradoxical outcome, every piece of artifact mana in existence. But there's also been some Tendrils version,
right,
where it's basically a Storm deck that squeezes a couple Monastery Mentors in it so that it can, half go off and make a token army and kill you with that instead.
Right. So in with paradoxical outcome, you essentially have two builds. You have the mentor-based builds, which they're less fragile, right? They've got more ways to work around hate and things like that. And then you have the pure kind of paradoxical Storm decks, which are going for the Tendrils kill. So
even those are right.
Right, and that actually started being a little bit less of the meta share. It seemed like the more popular paradoxical outcome deck was based around Monastery Mentor as the win con. So that deck moving forward, a lot of them were only running 2 mentors. So it's going to be interesting seeing, does just having access to 1 really kill the paradoxical outcome mentor deck, or do you add in things like a Tendrils and give that as another win con option? Empty the warrens in the board, something like that. So it's going to be interesting.
I think you have to have a more Tendrils base. I don't think that pure Mentors your only win con paradoxical deck is going to survive.
Yeah,
the Tendrils base might.
I think the Tendrils one will.
For just Monastery Mentor is worth it.
Right.
For a single Monastery Mentor.
And this is an interesting discussion because a card that we're going to get into a little bit more later is Yawgmoth's Bargain being unrestricted. As is, if these sort of mentor or paradoxical decks were no longer viable, it'd be kind of like, well, who gives a shit? You could just play the other paradoxical deck.
Yeah.
But now, if paradoxical mentor isn't really good anymore, and you have to start considering, do I want to play just like straight paradoxical Storm, or do I want to play something like TPS? That creates a much more interesting tension, I think. So it'll be kind of cool to see where that goes.
It's going to be interesting. I think it'll be kind of exciting having the possibility of two Storm decks. One very artifact mana, fast acceleration based, and another kind of classic, Demonic Pact and kind of, or not Demonic Pact.
Yes, please. Demonic Pact Storm.
Not Demonic Pact.
You just accelerate it.
It's getting to me a little bit.
Demonic Pact with Time Vault and Voltaic keys, so you can just work your way through the functions faster.
Yep.
I'm down.
Yeah, there you go. Don't eat that bad boy.
We mean the Pact, or what's the card called?
Demonic Dark Petition?
Dark Petition.
What a quality cast we're doing here.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's kind of a fool's errand here to really talk about what we think the post-mentor, blue share of the meta is going to be, because it's so... Everything was funneled into Monastery Mentor. It was just the best thing you could be doing. Nobody really doubted it. And it being there as a one of, I think we'll probably still see some of these Mentor cantrip decks with some young pyromancers. I don't know how effective that's going to be, but people will be trying it. You're going to see these, storm-based decks. Some people online last night were suggesting, basically that Tendril Storm deck with a 1-of Mentor, so you have 2 different ways to kill. And I don't know if that's effective, but people are going to try it. You're going to see more regular TPS, Tinker decks, stuff like that were suppressed by the Mentor. That'll be coming back. People will be trying Oath. People will be trying just everything.
I mean,
Standstill. We see tons of people testing that too. It opens everything.
Is a 1-of Mentor basically just like kind of Tinker number 2, where it's this other 3-mana like semi-I win button?
Card. Yeah, probably.
I think the big thing though is that, like what you're saying, Ben, it is completely open. I think that makes it really exciting, and that's something that the vintage metagame hasn't really been in a while. Is very exciting. You kind of went in expecting to either see the Jeskai Mentor decks or seeing at this point. I still think you're going to see some shops-based decks, and I think you'll see some blue decks, but there's going to be so much more diversity in that. And there's a chance to start brewing and kind of come up with some new ideas and concepts and stuff we haven't seen in vintage for a little while now. So I think it's going to be really, really good.
And not only are we getting rid of the choke that Mentor was putting on blue diversity, Thorn being restricted is probably going to open up a lot of different things that blue can do as well.
Right.
Yep.
It's a complete overhaul. I think it's the Wild West here for blue decks for the foreseeable future.
And that's maybe a convenient time for us to switch into discussing Thorn.
Yep.
What listeners might intuit from this, given the fact that I've never played Mentor, Ben has played the deck like once, Patrick's played it a little bit online, but not much, is that
we don't know what the hell we're talking about.
Well, I think no one does with Mentor. I'm counting that with post war restriction. We don't know what we're talking about.
I just think that sort of emotionally, there's not much love lost for us with Mentor being gone.
No,
it doesn't. None of us really are sad to see it go, and likewise, I don't think it's going to impact exactly what we're playing. Obviously, we're going to have to now recalibrate what we're on, but for the most part, it's not like I'm going to show up at the next Vintage event and be like, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing now that Mentor's not here.
Before we transition from blue, though, I am kind of curious. Like, this is a bit unprecedented for Vintage. We've had 2 restrictions, like large restriction announcements, relatively quickly back to back. So previously, we restricted Gush and Probe in kind of hitting those blue decks, and now we're hitting Mentor. And there was a lot of advocates very early on that wanted to see Monastery Mentor go before things like Probe and or Gush. So I think it's interesting to think about what the blue meta is going to look like now versus what it might have looked like if Mentor had been hit very early or in the last restriction, essentially. So it is tough because you take something like the blue-red Delver deck, which worked really, really well with Gush. Now you've taken that away, as well as now you've got Mentor gone as well. It's a bit interesting thinking about like what the meta could have looked like with Mentor gone versus now. It's complete speculation, so probably not worth talking about. But it's interesting kind of seeing this evolution of the blue metagame.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of heartburn over Wizards' reasoning on the last restriction and whether, hitting one deck in order to bring down that and another deck was reasonable. And I thought it was. I thought they made sense. Their didn't work. And part of that is I think historically there's been a few natural predators to shops that Mentor was suppressing. And I don't think those natural predators to shops, Dredge and Oath are the 2 I'm thinking of.
Right.
I don't think that they're as powerful against shops as they historically have been.
Yeah.
I mean, Dredge used to beat up shops pretty well. Now that they have Ravager and Ballista and Hangerback Walker that can just exile their Bridge from Belows for 0,
yeah,
it's not nearly as bad of a matchup. Both the druids similarly a lot of lands, and you can kind of just make a big ballista and shoot him in the face a few times, and it's more competitive against Oath as well. So some of the recent printings have done that to it, and I think it was becoming evident that this wasn't just Shops wasn't a meta deck. It was actually just a really powerful deck on its own.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of the discussion about the last BMR is sort of like it's essentially a hindsight is 2020 situation. You know, the logic behind weakening Gush decks made sense to me. Oh, we've got Ben's dog.
Yeah.
For listeners who don't know, Ben has two Great Danes, which are like essentially elephants.
They're small Danes. One's 130, the other's 120.
Oh, no big deal.
Yeah.
So anyway, like, look, I know a lot of people before there was a Gush restriction felt strongly it was a bad idea, but for the most part, I know why Wizards did what they did with the Gush restriction and with
I feel good about it as well. I just wonder a little bit what some other decks, like, would there be more of an aggressive blue deck based around Gush? You know, probably with Pyromancer and Delver. Are we going to miss that moving forward now that we've hit kind of Probe, Gush, and now Mentor moving forward versus having Mentor before? But again, that's hindsight, and I think it's going to be pretty exciting moving forward and what we see. So,
looping back to a point Stu made here just a second ago was that, yeah, when we were talking Mentor, we're all excited about the Mentor restriction and whatnot. All three of us are Thorn of Amethyst guys, so this might be a little bit more interesting of a discussion here on the Thorn part.
Yeah. I mean, across formats here, I think that all three of us get a lot of pleasure out of being semi-sadistic and trying to lock our opponents out of things. You know, Patrick at the beginning of the call mentioned he's been playing Dragon Stompy and Legacy lately. You know, I
historically a lot.
Yeah, I've played a lot of Mud. I play a lot of Wasteland decks in general. I play a lot of Blood Moon. Ben has had a number of very, very sadistic things that he's done to his opponents.
Yeah, doing sadistic things to my opponents is part of the joy of Magic.
So with that, it shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise to anyone. The three of us, I think, have a lot of love for brown decks.
Absolutely.
As a bit of background, I started playing Vintage sometime in probably late 2014 or early 2015. I'd gotten back into Magic some number of months beforehand, and I had a local game store in Boston that did proxy Vintage. This was during the heyday of Forge Master shops, and I loved that deck. Ben introduced me to it. I thought it was so cool, so I put together like 10 proxy Forge Master shops. I played it. I was percent of the room was on shops, which was just like awful. Like in retrospect, I feel terrible for anyone not playing shops during that time because it was probably miserable to show up. But like, point being, I loved that deck. I had a lot of fun with it. Eventually, we got the Chalice and Lodestone restrictions, and I think that version of the deck kind of died off. But I loved it. That like led me to Mud and Legacy and everything thereafter. And you two probably are in some form of similar boat.
Shop's been my primary deck. Shops and Oath of Druids have been my two Vintage decks for a long time. So I played Shops for quite a while. And I love the deck, but I mean, I'll even admit it got to that point here right before this restriction where something needed to be done about it. It was too powerful and consistent and everything. I mean, yeah, you have those decks that are 60-40 favorites against Shops and suck against everything else. It's like that's not enough to do it. It was just too good.
Yeah, and I'm also in the same boat. And my apologies to all the blue mages for even trying to discuss the Mentor restriction. I brutalized that. But prison style decks are definitely where my love for the format lies. I played Stacks at the Goyf Invitational and won drunkest. So that's what matters to me. And missing a lot of chalice triggers is kind of my favorite thing. So moving forward, we're going to see the restriction of Thorn, and obviously deck near and dear to kind of all of our hearts. So where do we go from here when it comes to seeing a 1 of Thorn now?
Well, and just to reiterate, it's a deck that's near and dear to all of us, but I don't think anyone on this cast is upset that Thorn is restricted, are we?
It's fine.
Not.
Yeah, I think it's okay.
Depends what you mean. I do not think that Thorn was the right restriction, but I do think something needed to get restriction, so I'm not going to complain about it.
Well, that might be a good time to bring up sort of the elephant in the room. One of the other big targets that was mentioned, if you wanted to weaken shops, was Workshop itself.
Yeah, that's the $800 gorilla in the room.
Yeah.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on this topic because it wasn't restricted. And personally, I don't think it's ever going to be restricted unless they break the reserve list and print Workshops and make it a $5 card. I don't think it was the right.
Yeah.
Wait, what was that?
That would be worse than a restriction for the people who are worried about the price.
So I don't think it's going to be restricted personally. And I don't think it was the correct restriction either, for reasons I'm happy to elaborate on, but that I don't know are constructive to do so. Ben, you brought this up. What do you think was the correct restriction?
Mishra's Workshop. I do. As much as, and it pains me to say it, I know a lot of people have a lot of money in their workshops, and it gets tense talking about such expensive cards, but I also own a place out of Workshops, and it's one of my favorite cards ever printed. But I think it's you have these other Thorn strategies that are just showing themselves not to be as broken as the shop strategies. White Eldrazi, no one's complaining that White Eldrazi's taking over the format. No one's complaining that colorless Eldrazi's taking over the format. I think those are great decks that they aren't too powerful. They're competitive, cheaper than some other decks. Let more people get into the game, and they're getting overrun by these Workshop decks because you're tapping for 3 colorless mana every turn. They're an absurdly broken card. And I don't know. I think if they restricted it, you might see the case where the Shops deck fades and kind of goes away because people are playing these Eldrazi decks instead. I don't know if that's 100% what would happen, but I think the Shops deck could survive a restriction. But let's assume that they're not restricting it due to the fact they don't want to piss off people who spend $3,000 on a set of Magic cards. After that, I still think that Sphere would have been the right restriction, just because, and I do agree with their logic that Thorn is the more powerful card in the deck, but Sphere is far more important to White Eldrazi, which again is not a problem. Far more important to colorless Eldrazi.
Thorn is more important.
So if it was up to me, I would have restricted Mishra's Workshop. If you couldn't do that, then I would have restricted Sphere of Resistance. It would have had less of an impact on the Shops deck, but I think the splash damage was more important.
Yeah,
and go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I think they obviously considered them both, and they went with Thorn because they felt it was going to be the more powerful impact for Shops. And regretfully, that is a lot of splash damage. But I wonder about is it that much more impactful? And yes, it is. I mean, you can still you can get a Ravager or something under those and not have to pay for it, where all the blue decks are just going to be stuck behind that Thorn.
I think sometimes people who don't play Shops don't see as much of the difference there, where there's like, oh, well, Sphere's, I've heard a lot of people say Sphere's the better card in Shops, and man, try playing Shops sometime. You get stuck under your own Sphere plenty of times, but those Thorns.
I'm sure it's happened to every Shops player is you get locked under your own Sphere. Someone else's single strip mine can completely set you off, or a null rod, right? It's just be destroyed by it.
Yeah, that's one mistake I made with my first ever Forge Master Shops build when I wanted to shave one Sphere effect, and I shaved a Thorn instead of a Sphere, and that's the last time I ever did that.
Oh,
once someone pointed out to me just how much better Thorn is in the deck, I've gone down to 2 Spheres before, but since then I've never shaved a Thorn. They've been a 4 of in every Shops deck I've ever played.
Yeah.
Well, so here's the thing. the last BNR with the Gush ban, splash damage was a bit of a discussion that was had, and I feel like there was some maybe fallout with the vintage community because people feel like they made this ban. It affected some other decks, like Doomsday would be an example of a deck that got hit by the Gush and Probe restriction, and the ban ended up being wrong. And with Thorn, there was again some splash risk. If they restrict it, it's going to hurt these decks like White Eldrazi. But what they saw last time is they did the wrong restriction, and this time they said, you know what, why don't we just maybe not think about splash damage as much? They acknowledged it in their announcement, but they decided to just go ahead and restrict it anyway. And maybe their reasoning is like, you know what, we can't really predict to this certain extent of what's going to happen to the rest of the meta, but if there's one deck we want to weaken, let's find the card we want to hit and hit it.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, and I think
we'll handle the Workshop problem. I do not think that we're going to see Chop Stack up 30-40% of the meta anymore. It's not going to do it with only one Thorn.
Yeah.
I think the biggest flip in matchups is going to be those storm-based decks. Whereas when you had, it's 10 sphere effects, right? You have 4 spheres, 4 thorns, a Trinisphere, and a Lodestone Column. Going down to 7, and when they have duresses, stuff like that can pick one thing out of your hand, I think that Storm matchup is going to be going from the worst matchup for Storm to close to a 50-50 matchup. Your Storm versus Shops matchup.
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because one of the things that I've heard a lot of talk about is, obviously you start talking about what you replace, and do you start seeing more Null Rod?
I mean, I'm an advocate of that. I've been playing Null Rod Shops for a little bit now, and I love it. It's not an archetype that gets, or a sub-archetype, I don't know what the terminology would be. It doesn't get that much attention. I think it's awesome. I think that you can build Shops in a way that's still a very strong deck and doesn't get hit by Null Rods that hard itself. But that card has single-handedly moved both my Storm and Oath matchups from being maybe problematic to being really strong. If you get it down, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, it was actually something we started to see quite a bit, maybe the last 6 months or so. This prevalence of the Ravager Shops with essentially the combo of Ravager and Walking Ballista, and just being able to swing in, eat your whole board, and just get these kind of turn 3, sometimes even turn 2 kills was just incredibly powerful. And so that started to become so prevalent that you actually saw other Shops builds kind of coming in and taking either the Null Rod approach, or very recently even going towards the Eldrazi builds, where they would bring in 4 Eldrazi Temples, 4 Thought-Knot Seers, and maybe some Reality Smashers to get around a lot of the artifact hate that was becoming very prevalent for the blue decks that were fighting against Shops. You got Thought-Knot Seer out there, you're not going to hit that with an Ingot Chewer. So you started to see a lot of kind of response to these, the Shops builds built around Ravager. So it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah. So so we should point out, if we're not going to see, take these top performing Shops lists, take out 3 Thorns, slap in 3 Null Rods, and go to town, because they get crushed by their own Null Rod. The Ravager Shops list really been the king for the last few months. So that's been the problem with Shops, is it's been this monolith of Ravager Shops with a few, Null Rod type builds on the side. If that, that Storm type matchup starts going negative for the Ravager lists, and you start seeing these Null Rod decks perform more, maybe we start seeing Shops. That would be wonderful. I'd love to see more different Shops decks.
I think we'll start seeing a split. I think you're going to go more in that aggro direction, right? Where maybe you bring in some hangerbacks to replace the missing Thorns.
Right.
And then the other direction,
combo matchup, but it helps your matchup against other creature decks tremendously.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But then in the other direction, you probably, we were even seeing a lot of Shops builds remove Tanglewire, right?
Yes.
For things like Precursor Golem, which is becoming more and more prevalent in the meta. So maybe we see some builds that start to bring in Null Rod, bring in Precursor Golem, go a little bit more heavy in that direction. So we might see a split in shops towards more of these aggro Ravager Ballista builds with maybe more hangerbacks, and then in another direction we go a bit more prisony, and then we can also talk about stacks a little bit later as well. Yeah. But we kind of go more towards the prison end, we go more towards the aggressive end, and one thing that I think we might see a little bit more of that fits in both of those builds is Phyrexian Metamorph, which we were starting to see a bit of in the last few months, becoming more prevalent. But it just seems really, really well situated at this point. From copying a Revoker and hitting another target to just getting another sphere effect on the board.
Dropping that Revoker under your Thorn of Amethyst.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
But not your
I agree. I think the archetype is going to be at a bit of a crossroads now in which you have to ask, does it make sense to go more aggro or more prisony? My gut feeling, and you guys could easily disagree with this, is if the deck does go more heavily aggro and essentially becomes sort of the vintage version of Affinity, is that I feel like the format can beat that pretty reasonably. Yeah. If you want to beat aggro shops, you either go under it by just comboing off before they do their thing, or alternatively, you just destroy artifacts. Wizards has been printing quality artifact destruction since 1993. If someone's goal is to just make a million tiny robots, you throw out something like Shatterstorm or whatever you want, blow up their board, and that's it. I think if you choose to go in the prison direction, you already have some existing quality answers. For instance, with my build, my plan right now is to try out Crucible's main deck and go a little bit more in that direction. We have an upcoming printing Sorceress Spyglass that could easily slot right in there.
We can talk about that for a while.
Yeah. Let's not expand on it right now.
Karn Silver Golem's another one of my favorites, especially if you're running lots of things like Tangle Wires and Crucibles in the main. Using a Karn to blow up their Moxen and then beating them to death with Tangle Wires is about as fun as it gets.
Yep. Yeah. So I think, again, I don't consider myself the strategic genius of Vintage, but I think there are two directions you can fundamentally go in with your shops right now. My guess is that the more prisony approach is going to ultimately be able to compete with what Vintage has to offer. But we'll see. We'll see. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, it's important to point out that things like this, all aggro type Ravager shops list is not like a glass cannon aggro deck. It still has 7 sphere effects in the main. That's got to be better than 50% have one in your opening hand, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have Trinisphere, Lodestone, 1 Thorn, and 4 sphere resistances.
Yep. And
when you're talking Storm, or you're talking a deck where 75% of the deck costs less than 1 mana, or even more than that, dogfight out back. That's 1 Thorn's all it takes a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that's why I'm personally not opposed to this restriction. I think that Shop still has the tools to keep degenerate blue decks in check, but it won't automatically be as dominant now.
Yeah. One thing that is concerning, though, and I wanted to get to this, was the non-shop Thorns deck, namely Colorless Eldrazi or White Eldrazi. And those I'm much more worried about in terms of their viability.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest hit, we haven't seen as much Colorless Eldrazi around. It's still an excellent choice, I think, if you're going to go unpowered for something like you're going to play Sanctioned Eternal Weekend. You're kind of riding on the back of Ancient Tomb and Null Rod at that point. But now not having Thorns is going to really hurt that deck.
Really hurts, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Maybe something like they traditionally don't run Spheres, right?
Just Thorns, I believe.
Just Thorns, that's what I think. So, I mean, you could replace them with Spheres, but Spheres hurts that deck pretty badly, and they don't have a 3 mana or land that taps for 3 mana to really make up for that easily.
Right. You just don't have it. The closest you can get is like an Eye of Ugin and Urborg.
White Eldrazi is a little different. I think they have the Thalia effects. I think a lot of White Eldrazi, and when I've played it, I've run 3 Thalia. I think one of the easier placements is go up to 4 Thalia. It's going to be a lot more essential now, right?
Yeah, but even a lot of those were running 4 Thalia. 4 Thalia, 4 Thorn. But the problem is that turn 1 play, right? And doing that in White Eldrazi becomes a lot more difficult if you've got to go 1 and a white versus 2 colorless.
And you want Sphere of Resistance in that deck? I don't know if...
I don't think so. I don't think you do. The closest I can think, and I've been thinking about this a little bit, I enjoy White Eldrazi quite a bit, is you could go up on Vring Wingmares, potentially. I still think the sphere-based effect is probably the best one. And then you could start to talk about other white hate bears that you could bring in, but I'm just not sure if that's what you want to be doing. Main deck
something like
Canonist or Spirit of the Labyrinth, Kataki. All of those are options, but it just doesn't seem overall as powerful as Thorn.
The one issue I've had with, and my first thought was Vern Windmare too. One issue I've had while playing White Eldrazi is getting white mana can be very clunky, especially when a lot of your white source is off of Cavern of Souls, where you're naming human or Eldrazi. I don't know if you want to add another creature type to that deck that needs white mana.
And this is why people have actually brought up Glow Rider is for another human.
Glow Rider is a human cleric. Blue and 2 non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast.
Right. So a lot of people have brought up Glow Rider over Vring Windmare just for being able to cast it off a Cavern on human.
Yeah. The other thought maybe is you go up a Stony Silence.
I think even Stony Silence has that same question about white casting cost, though, because you can't cast that off a Cavern. So that's why my inclination would be more towards Null Rod, just because, like, turn 1 Tomb Null Rod is a thing.
And I mean, you could add another Plains or something, but I think adding a Plains when you're removing sphere effects seems to be backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what I worry about is in White Eldrazi with Null Rod. I mean, what are you really achieving there? I mean, you're potentially slowing down, a larger blue deck with, it's going to rely on some Moxin or some faster mana. But against the shops, we're kind of talking about a lot of builds that might actually go in the Null Rod direction. So I'm just not sure if that's where the White Eldrazi is going to want to be. Yeah. But it really depends on how the meta shakes out with the Ravager shops and if that's still a very prominent deck or not.
Yeah. I mean, it all depends. I think of White Eldrazi as the vintage version of Death and Taxes. I know it's an easy comparison to make because it's white, but
I think it's got good parallels, though.
It's a meta deck, though.
Yeah.
So you're going to tune your hate bears and hate pieces to what's going on in the meta. So if we start seeing a lot more null rods and a lot fewer activated artifact abilities, you're going to want to get away from the Stony Silence. You start seeing a lot of creatures, you're probably just add a Swords to Plowshares, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, that's what's really cool about it, though, is that you do have a lot of options in white, right? You could, shop still stays really prevalent. You can go up on Katakis. If, some of these storm decks become really prevalent, Null could be good, but then you also have access to things like Aethersworn Canonist. Or Spirit of the Labyrinth, right? To kind of slow these down a little bit.
Right. That's another. Is that a human? It's a spirit, right?
Yeah, that is not a human. So same.
Maybe going Thalia. I don't know. It's going to take some tweaking.
Yeah, the new Thalia is an option as well.
The Thorn was critical to that deck.
Yep. So I just stepped away to get a beer, so I might have missed some really insightful commentary from you.
Don't worry, it wasn't that insightful.
Yeah, we're discussing Thorn of Amethyst. It can't be that intelligent.
Besides the Mentor Storm deck we discussed earlier, White Eldrazi is the deck I'm most worried about in terms of it possibly not being viable anymore after this. it'll be interesting to see how it adjusts. And a lot of that depends on what the meta turns to, because it's so dependent on what happens with the meta that we don't really know. Before we know how that shakes out, we don't know how you should do an Eldrazi deck.
And I'm a little hopeful. I like the deck a lot. I like that it kind of opens up another style of play that we don't see a lot of in Vintage, kind of another creature-based, slightly prison-esque. I think a good analog is to Death and Taxes and Legacy. But I hope it doesn't go away. What I'm hopeful about is that it mainly being in white does give it a lot of options to adjust to the meta and kind of go in that direction. And if casting things that are white off of non-cavern mana becomes an issue, that deck can also adjust its mana base a bit to be a bit more resilient to that. Whether it's Caves of Kolios or all sorts of different things where you can work around that a little bit. So hopefully, I think the community will work on it, and hopefully it'll be a deck that sticks around.
I'm very hopeful on that.
Thorn does hit a few other fringe decks if we're ready to move away from White Eldrazi.
Yeah, sure.
So I guess the other big one is probably well, not super big, but Hate Bears, another unpowered, sometimes unpowered version. Hate Bears is going to be a tough one. I'm not sure how much Thorn was essential to that deck. I personally haven't played that deck at all, so I'm not sure. I know most of them are running 4 Thorn, 4 Thalia, and then a suite of other utility creatures. But beyond that, I don't know a ton. I just know it's one of the more prominent Thorn decks.
Very hateful. It's in the name. Stu plays it. You played that deck at
Eternal Weekend last year.
Yeah.
I played that deck for a minute, and it was fun. I was specifically on like the white trash variant, which is unpowered, mono white. It's using like spirit guides to try to power some shit out, and it's like a lot of wastelands and ghost quarters and stuff. The build I was on wasn't playing Thorn, so from that sense, I wouldn't be that worried about it. I think that archetype has some issues regardless. Like, for instance, if your opponent just makes like a Massacre or a Sulfur Elemental, you just lose.
Yeah,
so
it's build anyway. I mean, it wasn't a tier 1 deck anyway, and it had its problems before.
Right.
It was a good competitive budget option, and anything that hurts, that's bad for the format.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think more so than in any other format, concerns for budget options are legitimate, both with this and colorless Eldrazi. These are ways that people can buy into the format without dropping a few grand on either power or bazaars or whatever. If we see these budget options start to get hit, it's just one less or some number less of players that we're not going to have showing up at events anymore.
Yeah, that's probably the most unfortunate thing about the Thorn restriction. I don't think it's going to affect shops in a critical way. I mean, we're still going to see it be a prevalent deck, whether it goes the aggro way or the more prison-y way. But I'm hopeful that it still allows things like some budget options around colorless Eldrazi or something like that to be there. But I'm pretty nervous about that.
Unless you guys have more to say about Hate Bears, I have 1 or 2 other points about shops itself that I wouldn't mind returning to here.
Sure.
I guess 2 main points. One is that, earlier we were talking about the idea of restricting Workshop instead of Thorn. And, I think Ben has opinions about that, and that's something a lot of people have opinions about. I think in particular, I'll say a number of people who only play Vintage casually, which I would include myself in that demographic, will tell you they've played a few events and they just think Workshop should be restricted. A common line is that it's a repeatable Black Lotus. You'll hear things like that, which is true. But my experience has been that if you drill down with a lot of people who say Workshop should be restricted, what it ultimately comes down to is thoughts or especially feelings about the fact that they don't ever get to cast their spells. A lot of people hate the idea of an intro that's like Workshop Trinisphere or, that's obviously not that common. You could also do Shop Mox Golem, Shop Chalice, Shop Thorn, Shop Sphere. With that, if they do ultimately, they've restricted Thorn here, so now the only unrestricted lock piece is Sphere. Eventually, Sphere might get hit too if Shops is still a problem. Do you think people's feelings about Workshop will change? Or do you guys maybe just disagree with that premise that the actual problem is people don't get to cast their spells?
It's probably a bit of both. I mean, I know I've been under Shops locks before plenty of times too, and it does suck. I've also been on the other side of it, and it's glorious. But I think most players are reasonable people, and we'll see that it's. That's probably the most controversial thing we'll say on this cast. Most players are reasonable people, but I see that it's just so present too. Like, all right, I hated playing against Miracles in Legacy. But you'd show up at a 10-round event, you'd see Miracles once, maybe twice. You show up at a 10-round event in Vintage, you're almost guaranteed to see Shops 3 times, right? At least.
Yeah.
But when you're running into those kind of annoying decks over and over and over, and it's clearly the best deck in the format too, it gets a lot more annoying really easily. But to go back to what you were saying too, I don't think that all these, it's a repeatable Black Lotus. I don't think that's quite fair. Black Lotus doesn't basically have the text of you can't play Ancestral Recall in your deck. You get a lot. It funnels you into artifacts only, and it's a huge deck building restriction. One that it's clearly overcome, but it's pretty tough. I know Patrick was playing the Eldrazi Shops hybrid last time. How many times did you get stuck with, I could slam a 2-1 Thought-Knot Seer, except this is a Mishra's Workshop in my hand and I can't do anything, and I'm never going to cast this Thought-Knot Seer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of advantages to playing Mishra's Workshop and a lot of trade-offs. And I think it with a lot of decks in Vintage, when you put that deck in your card, or you put that card in your deck, you're then looking at like the next 10 or 15 cards automatically, and a whole slew of other things that you can't play. So it really comes down to what you want to do. There's always going to be those broken turns of, turn 1 Trinisphere or Shop Mox Golem that are really, really hard to work around. And those are those free wins, but they're the free wins that, a Dredge is going to get going off on turn 1 as well. So it's Vintage. Awesome things happen. I think that's why a lot of us love to play the format. But we have really, really good ways to hate them out as well. And so it's a format of fun, broken things, but hopefully there's enough of that and enough different spectrums that we can keep having fun with it. And I'm actually really hopeful that this ban and restriction does just that. Makes it a bit more diverse, makes it a bit more fun.
Yeah. So to go a little bit more into the Mishra's Workshop thing is, I think it's a, they don't have to restrict Mishra's Workshop right now. I think Thorn's going to solve the problem, but they keep printing good artifacts. Just in the last year, we got Foundry Inspector and Walking Ballista, which are amazing. I love both those cards. But, I mean, over-under 18 months before they have to restrict another artifact due to it being broken with Mishra's Workshop.
Okay, so this is the other.
It's gonna keep happening. If we sorry to interrupt you again. If we restrict Mishra's Workshop, you could probably free Chalice of the Void, you could probably free Thorn of Amethyst, and you could probably free Lodestone Golem.
So this is my other point that I wanted to make, is because that's the other big retort that I hear when we talk about restricting Workshop versus anything else. And to me, I don't see a problem with that system in the sense that the non-Workshop decks are subject to something very similar. We look at these blue decks in Vintage, and they're all like singletons, basically. Like we're playing 65 EDH.
Blue stew.
Exactly, the blue stew. Why can't Workshop be in the same boat where all of these things that are getting printed, or all of these older cards like Thorn and Chalice, are getting restricted, but we still have our fundamental engine of Mishra's Workshop adding extra mana every turn? Is it such a problem that Wizards keeps printing these artifacts and has to restrict them?
So my main retort to that, I guess, is it's possible in the blue shell because you have the ability to cantrip. You have the ability to filter your card draw a little bit. So you may have one-ofs, but you have ways to find them, ways to dig for them, and ways to get rid of the things you don't need. We have a little bit of that in the more brown archetypes. We've got Inventor's Fair to go look for things we need.
Coercive Portal.
Coercive Portal is a great thing that we see a little bit in stacks. But I feel like the blue stew, kind of where you have a bunch of one-ofs, essentially, becomes a bit more viable, where you can look for, okay, I don't need card draw right now, I need removal, or I need artifact hate. You can filter through your deck a little bit more, where a lot of the people who are going to be playing the workshop archetype are just, it's all going to be what's on top of your deck at a given moment. And you may get that third or fourth kind of sphere effect when you really need a threat, and there's no way to find that. So I feel like the variance issue becomes a much bigger one when you're talking about a pile of one-ofs.
I actually love the variance in Vintage. I love that you get a lot more different, unique game situations due to there being so many one-ofs. That Legacy feels very consistent due to all the 4-ofs and the 4 Brainstorms and the 4 Ponders, whereas you see some crazy stuff in Vintage due to the differences in cards. But my answer to Stu's question earlier is, it's not like there's this 600-pound elephant in the room for blue decks that is sitting there unrestricted that's causing all those cards to get restricted. It's Monastery Mentor is your closest thing. That's the thing that is causing a lot of these blue cantrips to get restricted, and they properly restricted that.
Sure.
If the only answer to thin out the blue stew would be to start banning things, which, that just goes against everything that Vintage stands for. So if there was a card...
600-pound elephant, heavy elephant.
No, it's pretty light.
It's a pretty small elephant.
That's like a baby elephant.
Yeah, a baby elephant.
No, I agree with you there.
If you showed me a card that you could restrict in Vintage that would allow you to unrestrict a lot of those broken blue draw spells, I'd do it in a second. I just think it's the right thing.
Sure.
Yeah. Please don't restrict Force Will.
All right. Well, I think unless you guys have more to say about Thorn and Workshop, this consistency discussion might lead into the unrestriction in this announcement, Yawgmoth's Bargain.
Yes.
I think one of us here, as a disciple of Yawgmoth, is very excited.
Can you see the glint in Ben's eyes right now? He's so excited for this.
Oh man, I am just like, that was my favorite part of the announcement. As much as I hated Monastery Mentor and wanted to see it go and wanted to see something change in shops, I was thrilled when I saw the unrestricted Yawgmoth's Bargain. And, well, it's just, I'm a big fan of unrestrictions in general. I want to be able to play with as many cards as possible, but so it's just showing that they're actually looking at the restricted list, looking at things and saying, hey, this might not be that broken. We should try it out. And to restrict a card like Yawgmoth's Bargain, or unrestrict a card like Yawgmoth's Bargain, shows they're really thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because, can you name a card that when it hits the table, you're more likely to win than Yawgmoth's Bargain? That's like, I don't think I've ever lost a card on the table. What was that, Patrick?
Monastery Mentor?
Yeah, fair enough. Yawgmoth's Bargain is a wonderful card, but it costs 6 mana. This is Vintage.
Yeah.
It's bad in multiples. Not only is it not good in multiples, you don't want to have multiple Yawgmoth's Bargains in your hand because they're doing nothing. And then once you draw things with it, or once you start drawing with the bargain, picking up more bargains that's wasted life. You don't want to do that.
Sure.
It's dead if you revoke it. Like, it shuts off your draw step. And
yeah, you're really dead if they revoke it.
It's also not a 7/7 with lifelink and flying.
Well, don't you start hating on my boy Grizzlebrand. but it's an amazing combo engine. It's wonderful when it hits the table. It's very powerful, but it has its major drawbacks. And I was playing Type 1 when Yawgmoth's Bargain originally got printed and almost immediately restricted. And it was a different format then. It was slower. It was easier to get Bargain out. And it deserved it at the time. But this format is going to be able to handle Yawgmoth's Bargain. This is not going to break the format at all.
So where do you think it's gonna end up? And I mean, are we gonna see it as a 2 of, maybe even a 3 of? Seems a lot.
Yeah.
But, you know,
it can't be 4, right? Like no one's playing a play set of this.
One great thing is that it's in black, which happens to be the best color for finding cards.
Sure.
So I mean, that's the other thing, is to get it on the table. I mean, yes, this is vintage. You can get it on the table pretty easily. But if it gets countered or revoked or anything, you just invested a lot in it. So say you go turn 1, Black Lotus, Dark Ritual, Yawgmoth's Bargain, it gets Force of Will. Congrats, you just lost 3 cards, including 2 very powerful mana accelerators in the Storm deck. So it gets a little bit of a gamble there. I don't know where it's going to go, though. I see some Storm decks. People are going to be brewing with this card. It's a wonderful card to brew with. You're going to see some decks that are a little more focused on getting a bargain on the table and then just wrecking face from there. And I'm excited to see it. There hasn't been much combo in vintage recently. The format that doesn't ban ridiculous, powerful combo cards has not seen much combo, and that's an awful thing.
I think probably the latest one we've seen is really this kind of prevalence of the paradoxical outcome decks, and it's kind of the most combo-y thing that we've been doing for a while now. And
now sorry, go ahead.
That's something I can see going in the deck together. Paradoxical and Yawgmoth's Bargain work pretty well together. Paradoxical can help you generate a ton of mana. You're already in tons of mana acceleration, and it's a way to draw a bunch of cards that doesn't rely solely on bargain. But here's the bargain, they're freaking total.
Here's my question, though, is that deck isn't even running the 1 of, right? You don't even see Yawgmoth's Bargain in the Paradoxical Storm decks now. Does it make it that much better, or does it become something different?
It'll become something different, I think. I think it's a black-based deck. You're going to take, I would take mostly my TPS shell, add 1 to 2 bargains, and you already have Necropotence too, which remember does something very similar. So I'm thinking you add 1 bargain, and you focus a little bit more on getting the bargain out. And I haven't played enough Storm to know how you're going to do that, and I don't know if that's going to be a broken strategy, but I'm just glad we get to experiment with it.
Yeah, I think obviously, I mean, Ben, you probably know the most about this and have played the most kind of decks similar to the shells of what's going to include this, but it seems like a very good unrestriction. You know, nothing off the bat is immediately being like, this is entirely broken, it's going to destroy the format. I think this is a really good direction and an excellent step by the DCI in terms of looking at both ways, both of what we need to restrict and both of what can be opened into the format. So this is great.
I was worried that was getting a little bit stale. I can't remember, what was the last unrestriction in vintage?
Gush, right?
Was Gush the last unrestriction? Could have been. I'm not sure. Oh, Regrowth got unrestricted.
Oh, that's right.
Like 2015. That was
okay.
Regrowth have been unrestricted in 2005. But that's the thing. I worry they get a little stale. I mean, I think there's some few cards on the Legacy ban list that are just like very obvious unrestriction candidates. Mind Twist is the first thing that comes to mind. I think there's a few more things on the vintage restricted list that probably could come off as well. Windfall was one they mentioned, and I think that would be a great unrestricted.
Yeah, I'd like to see Chalice come off.
I would too. I would like to see Chalice. Not sure if that's the WoW shots.
I think we got a little bit of feedback going on.
Yeah, there was a little feedback.
No, the reason
my bad.
I think it's all good now. But yeah, I think it's very forward of them. I love the discussions they've had around it, but it's really nice to see things coming off the restricted list as well as going on. You know, things that I think everyone agrees. You know, we had kind of a 2-deck format at this point with Mentor and Shops. We've hit them both. Hopefully that figures out a lot of things of the format. We also get something new and something we can brew with. So I think it's making for a really exciting format moving forward. I know, you know, we're kind of leading up to Eternal Weekend, Vintage Champs. They did announce that there will be another ban restricted announcement before Eternal Weekend. But they made some comments around the fact that they're aware that a lot of things have been shook up, and it's the day before. Is that right?
I think so, right?
Monday.
It's like the 17th or something.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's the Monday before, but it would go into effect on Friday of Eternal Weekend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The first day
like,
that the change would be legal would be Vintage Champs.
Right.
So you guys might know better than me, but have they ever done this type of thing before? I don't think so, where they've like consciously announced the relationship this has to real life events.
I don't know. I can never remember that happening. I'm glad they added that though. Do you have the addendum in front of you, Patrick? A bunch of people might have missed this.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it. Okay.
Yeah, when did this go up? Like a few hours after, right?
I think maybe 6 or 8 hours afterwards. I'm sure WotC and the DCI got a lot of feedback, kind of everyone around Eternal Weekend. So the editor's note is we are aware of the proximity of the next B&R window to Eternal Weekend, which is why we've chosen to make necessary vintage changes in this window. We don't currently anticipate any more changes to vintage in the next fandom restriction, but in the event that they are needed, we'll have a solution for communicating changes in a way that respects the preparation for Eternal Weekend players. So that's pretty incredible. Essentially, and I think they're right. Like it'd be very unexpected to see something this quickly following these changes. These are going to shake up the format quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fair to move forward for a few months, especially in a format that's not going to have a lot of ways to play test and get things out in terms of information-wise to the community before Eternal Weekend. But if they do anticipate something, they say that they're going to find a way to communicate that to everyone. And that's very respectable. I mean, a lot of people are coming out. This is the one big chance of the year to play the large kind of the vintage championships, right? This is it. So they're taking kind of due course to make sure the community is aware of this, know that they're aware of it, and find ways to communicate that. So props to the DCI on that.
Yeah, I mean, like props to the DCI in general for this announcement. I think at the start of the call we framed this with the idea that this whole thing has been worded very well. They've done a good job explaining the changes they chose to make, but this added layer of communication is great. I think as bitchy Magic players, we have a tendency to give the DCI shit about any announcement they make. We give Wizards of the Coast shit about stuff because they're like this monolithic entity that's part of Hasbro, but this is great communication. This is what I want as a customer.
You can't be mad about this.
They made 3 good, smart changes and communicated well, and that addendum added onto it. I think they did a great job, especially on the Yawgmoth bargain.
I can't wait to see you get brewed up for the next Goif.
Oh yeah, I'll probably play some bargain. I'm just thrilled they're looking at unrestrictions. That's one of my biggest complaints, is that there's so many cards on there I don't think they can be restricted. The fact they're even looking at it, as long as they consider it, they might not come to the same agreement on what needs to be unrestricted, but it shows they're thinking about it.
So 2 days ago, Yawgmoth's Bargain was a restricted list card worth like $3, I think. And I went on our local game store, Pat's Games, has an online card ordering system that I think is somehow tied into Star City Games pricing. And after the announcement yesterday, they had Yawgmoth's Bargain listed at like $40.
Yeah, that's stupid.
Yeah, no, it's absurd. I wonder where that card's going to finish out at. Probably like $5 to $10.
Was it 3 before? It's probably going to be 4 now.
Yeah, right? Like,
well, it's going to go from a 1 to a 2 of in a few vintage decks that I don't think.
Yeah,
but player base is just so dinky.
I'm sure we could rant a lot about restricted list buyouts and entity finance in general, which none of us, I don't think, support too much. Like we're about kind of playing the formats and enjoying it and making sure other people get to play it as well. And that just sucks.
You know what that is if SCG raised their price to $40, that's them waiting for a couple idiots to come along who think that an unrestriction in vintage is going to move the needle very much. People pay $40 for it, and cool, man. You come by and offer me $40 for my Young Lost bargain, it is yours.
Yeah.
I'll rebuy it in a week.
I mean, yeah, if you think it's worthwhile to spend money on buying shit out, you should just buy a printer instead and make your deck off that. But
well, if you're gonna buy something out, buy out a legacy staple. Don't buy out and this is an Urza's block card. It's not something only like 20,000 in existence.
Let's not buy out anything, Ben.
Yeah.
Well, I'm saying if you're trying to buy that out, you're stupid. That is a terrible buyout card.
Yeah.
At least get something EDH.
So,
well, it's on the back of all these reserve list buyouts, which is complete shit anyway, but it's par for course in terms of what the finance community is trying to do. I mean, their margins have obviously like collapsed for standard type things, and they're looking for other avenues, and I just don't think it's working. So yeah.
Can you really call it the finance community?
No.
Finance cabal?
Probably just a couple pricks.
Yeah.
Well, I get in on the MTG finance stuff a little bit, but it's to save myself money, not to try and gouge people on random unplayable cards.
Well, that's
I look
fair.
for things like, there's some random card that's really good, but it's down right now in Modern, so the price is in half. Then I just buy a playset even though I don't need it. So then when I do need it, and it's through the roof, and
You're buying,
that's fine.
You're buying a playset for yourself, though. It's not.
Yeah.
Buying TCG player out so that there are none, and then relisting them at like 10 times the price. That's a very.
I mean, if that's what you like to do, then whatever. That's enjoy. I'm not going to complain about how people try and make money. It's just, geez, man, it doesn't seem like a good way to spend your time. Go get a second job.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's all just luxury anyway. Like, it's better than buying up pharmaceutical companies, but like.
And then buying.
So anyway,
Black Lotus.
Wow, we've completely degenerated at this point.
Let's buy a Wu-Tang album.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty much what we wanted to go over with the announcement itself. We had some other points though that are kind of tangential to this. One that I don't think any of us are passionate about, but that a large portion of the vintage community probably doesn't heavily disagree with, is that mental misstep was an interesting exclusion from this ban, or I should say restriction. I part of me wonders if maybe they're thinking that with Thorn restricted, there's less of a fundamental tension between Thorn and misstep. But that was one that, that card's been tossed around a lot as maybe being something to restrict. It's been banned in every other format it's in, and it wasn't touched here. Do you guys see that being a problem, or what's misstep going to look like moving forward?
I don't think it's going to change much, is it? I mean, people are still going to run their 2 to 3 missteps and not 4 because 4, you don't want it's bad against shops, and it's in that precarious place. My issue with misstep is I think it should be restricted, and it's not a power level thing. I think that's part of the reason why they're hesitant to restrict it. It's not a broken card. It's not overpowered. It's just something that happens in vintage that isn't very fun when people are shooting missteps back and forth at each other, but something you kind of have to play in order to survive. So I don't think anyone would miss it if it goes.
Yeah.
There's no dedicated mental misstep players who are going to be pissed off. It's just a stupid card, and everyone kind of agrees with that.
Yeah, it's right up there. I mean, Phyrexian mana, Delve. I mean, it's all all kind of shitty ways that are just, I don't know. It kind of messes up the format on all of their own unique ways, and it's there right now. I don't think it's necessarily going to go away, but it can be restricted, and I think that'd be fine. It's not going to change things a ton. Again, it's going to hurt your shops matchup if you got 3 missteps on the board, but that's what it is. And yeah,
I think it's an interesting argument that restricting misstep is bad for shops, and it's weird that restricting a card that you don't play in a deck is bad for that deck, but it makes some sense. I mean, I don't think it's going to then that's going to be the downfall of shops, is a mental misstep restriction. But it really does feel shitty when you have a hand opener with 2 mental missteps and your opponent goes Mishra's Workshop Thorn, and you're just like, okay, well, I basically mulled 5.
Right.
You know, it's but you kind of have to do it, otherwise you just lose to the other blue decks that are misstepping the shit out of you.
Well, moving forward, it will be making less monk tokens, so that's one thing.
It will. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've never really bought the argument about banning or restricting things with the idea that it forces people to play more relevant cards. But what I do like about the idea of restricting misstep is it opens up some archetypes that might be better against shops. Like, you know, if you're playing a bug deck and your goal is to like make turn 1 Deathrite with 4 mental missteps running around, that's a lot harder for you to do. If that card's restricted, what's that?
All right, Goblin Welder's another great example of that.
Yeah, exactly. And these are cards that if that card got restricted, they'd be much more viable now. I don't think you can use BNR restrictions exactly to anticipate how people are going to play. I think the Gush restriction was a good demonstration of that. But if you can restrict something that makes other decks viable, that can attack metagame predators or just strong decks in general, like shops, that's a good thing. I don't know. It'd be nice to see it go. Again, all 3 of us are really Thorn players at heart. So
it'd be good for it to go, though. Yeah. I mean, it does take out a lot of archetypes. I mean, hitting things like crop rotation. There's so many little things you could be doing to fight a lot of the different archetypes and maybe break into something new that it kind of shuts off just by accidentally having that misstep in your hand. It's not the best feeling. I mean, so
maybe lost in the shuffle here is how good of a defense mental misstep is against some of the really broken openers, like a quick Empiric Tutor or Ancestral Recall. Some of those just absurdly broken, stupid early vintage 1 casting cost cards that if your opponent has it and you don't, you lose the game. But mental misstep is great at taking some of those out. Ancestral Recall is the obvious target there, being able to misstep your opponent's recall. So one thing I like to say about Vintage, and Dark Ritual is another great one. One thing I like to say about Vintage when people say it's a turn 1 format is it has the most powerful spells, but it also has the most powerful answers. And maybe we're missing that mental misstep is one of those very powerful answers. How many times have you misstepped the Dark Ritual on turn 1 that you would have just died otherwise? Or you misstepped an Ancestral Recall that would have just gotten your opponent way ahead on resources. So there is that trade-off. There's that risk if you do restrict it that it becomes more turn 1-ish of a format and more luck of the draw of a format.
Sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole recurring theme in this call is that I think we can talk a lot about what could happen or what will happen, but it's hard to predict. I mean, if misstep gets restricted, that's something I would love to see, but you might be right that the format just gets more degenerate. People start winning on turn 1.
I wouldn't be shocked if they restricted it and 6 months later they unrestricted it because the format actually got worse. I don't think that would happen, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. So that's sort of the announcement overall, and maybe what was missed in the announcement. Throughout, we've kind of talked about what we see happening moving forward with specific decks. But going into the cast, something we said we wanted to talk about is maybe overall what the meta is going to look like moving forward. Is there anything that we've overlooked when we're discussing these specific restrictions that you guys might like to touch on as far as overall where the meta is going?
Not a ton. I think we've done probably a horrific job of speculating what the blue meta will look like at this point. One thing I am kind of excited to think about is what if Oath might be a little bit better positioned at this point. That's a deck I think a lot of us would like to see come back a little bit. And so that's maybe the only thing I have is just, is Oath a little bit better positioned now that the Mentor kind of control deck is maybe a bit more subdued.
And Dredge. Dredge hates to see white on the other side of the board. They got Rest in Peace and Containing Priest.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll see some more Dredge coming back. And I don't think the Thorn restriction, I don't think Dredge cares about that much, but it is still favored against shops. So maybe with fewer containment priests running around, it gets to be a little bit more of a predator on shops, and maybe Oath gets to do the same thing with fewer containment priests running around. So I don't know. I'm hopeful we see more diversity. I think we will see more diversity, but I'm not going to predict what type of diversity we'll see, just so in 6 months you guys can't make fun of me for how horribly wrong it's.
I think the big thing is just that, hopefully we'll move away from a dominantly kind of 2 archetype format. Hopefully it doesn't go to a single archetype format, but which
also I agree with you that hopefully it doesn't, except that if it goes to a single archetype format, at least then the answer is clear. It's like, let's say shops becomes like 80% of the meta, you're like, all right, we have to do something drastic as the DCI, and as players you're like, all right, this is it. I'm just like full on hating out shops.
I mean, if you become an interesting point with full on hating out shops is, I mean, I don't think it'll ever get to that super dominant shops meta, because are there in the game of Magic that hate on artifacts? No, it's good artifact hate, and if you pack your board with shops hate, you're gonna beat shops. So there's definitely a cap on how high it can go. It seems like that cap's at least 40% though, so that's not great.
It's hard to say. I mean, look at the local meta. If you guys look at what's going on in Houston, it was like shops was doing well. Tim Everett rolls up 2 vintage events in a week, or 2 vintage events in a row, and plays Merfolk. Like, on a local level, yeah, exactly. On a local level, if you want to hate out shops in particular, but a deck in general, you can do it, and you can do well. Yeah, it is tough when you start looking at national metas or MTGO. That's a little bit harder to do, but it's still like, if you've got a target in mind, you can go for it.
Yeah, our meta is like a really sick and twisted abomination of vintage. Though it's just
it's wonderful.
It is beautiful. It's beautiful in all of its horrificness. Like, it's
what proxy does for the meta is you
never. And we're always encouraging new players to come in, and always a bunch of pre-built decks ready. So it can be highly variable.
One thing is like, shops kind of has a cap. You can't go too high before everyone just destroys everything you play and then overwhelms you. A deck like that Mentor deck, I don't think that really has a cap. I don't know how you convincingly hate out Monastery Mentor with every deck. Like that Mentor deck, the Jeskai Mentor deck with the Dax and the J Strength Prime. I don't think that's that easy of a deck to hate out.
Spheres, right? And that's what came to prevalence. And I don't think it was a meta deck. I think it's a good deck on its own, but it also fought really well against one of the more prominent decks in the format. So
yes, that was a mistake that the GP made. That is, they thought it was a meta deck that would go down when the Prey left, but it was also just a really good deck on its own.
Right. So, all right.
So I've been happy with this call so far, and that I feel like we've all been positive and enthusiastic about what's going on. As a maybe before we transition to talking about the other significant component of the announcement, as a somewhat apocalyptic note, a lot of this discussion to me comes down to the fact that maybe vintage is reaching this sort of critical mass level in which things are inevitably going to take a turn for the worst. A popular term being thrown around right now is the blue stew. We're reaching a point where blue decks have again, critical mass of restricted cards. Everyone's playing a bunch of really, really good singletons that can barely be improved upon. Shops might also be reaching that point where they have this awesome mana base and then really powerful artifacts, and things are just going to keep getting better from here. And all Wizards can do is restrict or ban things potentially. Do you guys feel like that vintage has reached a point where maybe things are just going to get out of hand moving forward?
I don't think it's reached that point, but it is approaching that. That's definitely a concern. a few more restricted blue spells, and you're kind of at the limit. I mean, we could hit Preordain, although as goofy as it sounds to restrict Preordain in Vintage, it's a reasonable argument to restrict Preordain.
That shuffle effect is really good.
At that point where you have 20 blue good draw spells that are all restricted, and what are you going to do? My solution, I've been saying this, and some people look at me like I'm crazy when I say it, is not to ban things, increase the minimum deck size in Vintage. Go to 80 card deck size. That thins out the blue stew right there. Better than banning. I do not want to ever see a ban in Vintage that's not Charizard or Chaos Orb. But
I would love to.
I think it's the only thing they could do at that point, besides banning.
Yeah,
but I think we're pretty far from crossing that bridge. So
I'm inclined to agree with you. I also think that's maybe a more elegant solution than moving into banning territory.
Although all then we got to do is add some commanders, and we got a nice freaking powered EDH league. But anyway,
I don't know.
It is a concern. I agree.
Dude,
you can only restrict.
You just came up with commander.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess so. I have a warped perspective on the sense that, like, I don't play MTGO. I play Sanctioned Vintage like once a year. To me, and I don't take the format as seriously as a competitive option than a lot of other people do. I think Legacy is probably like the more balanced and competitive space you can be playing in if that's what you're looking for. So I don't mind if this format slowly glides in this direction of just there's an insane blue package, there's an insane colorless package, and let's like have them have this sort of eternal clash between the two. But you guys are probably more invested in the format than me, and potentially a lot of listeners are as well. So they might take issue with that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to see a healthy Vintage format, and it's definitely a concern that it's getting there. Once you start putting, you have Brainstorm, Ponder, Call, Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, Gush, Merchant Scroll, Mystical Tutor, and then if you're in black too, you add 3 awesome black tutors. Also Demonic Consultation, although that does get much worse as you get into every card in my deck as a restricted card. And well, I mean, I guess things like Yawgmoth's Will aren't really in that same category, but there's just so many ways to make a ridiculously broken draw engine. For Preordain is also legal right now. I think, if we start seeing more printings like Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise that get restricted, they're going to have to restrict Preordain as well, just because the engine's going to get too consistent. And I mean, is it that ridiculous at that point to add something like Sleight of Hand? As weird as that seems in Vintage?
Opt has to be it. Right?
Opt. There we go. We'll opt it. But yeah, it's a concern. Imagine if you have a 15, 20 card broken draw engine, then they can't do anything. They've already exercised as much of their power as they can, and that's the downside of the restricted list, is they can't banish something from the format. They just have to limit it. So once you limit too many things, then you've used up all your power.
Sort of. I mean, I guess at that point, it's just move toward to being like pure concentrated power. Every good new blueprinting either makes the cut or it becomes like.
So I see 3 possible solutions.
But okay,
there's banning, there's increasing the deck size, and there's printing specific hate to those types of decks.
So here's my counter argument. So take Legacy, for example, right? It's a format that a lot of decks can be defined by 4 Brainstorm, usually 4 Ponder. But you can get a lot of diversity there. You can have Grixis Delver, you can have Show and Tell, you can have the Numericals deck. They're all running that same kind of cantrip package, but they still have, and I think a lot of us would agree that Legacy's in a pretty decent place right now. There's a lot of kind of this Grixis, Grixis Delver, 4-color Grixis not even that wouldn't be Grixis.
Yeah.
But yeah, 4-color
Check
control in the check pile.
Yeah.
But you do have a diversity in formats and things that compete against it. If you have that in Vintage, so you have your 15 card package of things that you can cantrip with, you can do different things with it, you know, and you can have your oaths, you can have your big blue, you can have your tinker. You know, is it still a healthy Vintage format?
Yeah, you can have a diversity of strategy with the same cantrip engine.
So it might not be the worst thing in the world, right? It depends on how we define healthy, and I think a lot of us define it on, you know, a diversity of archetypes that are viable to play. You know, we don't have to be stuck in cantripping and doing our thing versus, you know, locking people out from doing that.
Yeah, so maybe the reason that this is coming up now is because of Monastery Mentor and the fact that everything was funneled toward Mentor.
Right. So that's what I'm really hopeful is that we see Mentor go. Now all of blue decks aren't playing one single win condition. We get a little bit more diversity and we get back to what we would classify as a much healthier format.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I agree.
Cool.
You changed someone's mind on a magic. Let's mark this day.
Color.
So I think moving forward, that's pretty much everything to do with the announcement. Something that we haven't touched on, though, is Ixalan and rules changes that are coming along with this BNR announcement.
Is that how you say it? Ixalan?
I think it's Ixalan.
I thought it was Pirates and Dinosaurs.
My phone auto corrects it to Italian, so I think the most obviously notable rules change that comes with it is how planeswalkers work. My general impression is that now everything is going to, in the planeswalker realm, be legendary. So, for instance, you could have a Jace Telepath Unbound and a Jace the Mind Sculptor play at the same time.
I think it's a great rule change. I love it. I don't think it's going to be that relevant in Vintage. Maybe you'll see a couple decks that run both Jaces and on very rare occasions ends up with both on the board. But it is frustrating sometimes when you see a new printing of a Planeswalker and you're like, oh, this new Jace or this new Liliana looks pretty good. But, well, that's not as good as Jace the Mind Sculptor, not as good as Liliana the Veil. I'm not even going to try it. So I don't think it's going to affect Vintage too much. Legacy, I think it's got some potential, though. I'm going to try a Liliana of the Veil plus a Liliana.
The Last Hope.
The Last Hope, yeah, in the same deck. Liliana the Last Hope's a pretty good card. It's just not as good of a card as Liliana the Veil.
That would be a sweet John's deck.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to try it in this deck.
you like traded away your Punishing Fire engine, right?
I don't have Grove of the Burn Willows now.
Grove, yeah.
Patrick has offered to loan them to me if I need them.
You got them if you need them.
I'm a John fan. Yeah, I mean,
I think overall, yeah. Overall, it seems like a good change. Vintage, I don't see it affecting very much. Besides, so Jace Fringe Prodigy flips to Telepath Unbound.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can never remember what his flip side is.
Yeah.
So him and the Mind Sculptor, I could see that's the one case where you might get them both out at the same time.
Yeah. That's not something heavily Vintage.
I don't think there were any decks that weren't purposefully running one or the other because of that ruling. So I don't think it's going to affect things too much. But it overall seems positive. Like I have no issue with it. I think it's great. It has a lot more implication than things like Legacy. Modern, I'm sure it's going to be insane. I've already heard about like Gideon Tribal.
The Gideon deck. Yeah, that's something. That seems so awesome.
Yeah. That actually does seem pretty sweet.
I think it was a layup of a change for them. It does stink when you can't play one card because another card just blocks it out like that. And
yeah, you never want to be shutting yourself off. Like
so, like maybe I could see
behind Sphere.
a big Jace control deck, a big blue deck. You know, going from 3 Jace the Mind Sculptors to 2 Mind Sculptors and a Jace Fringe Prodigy, just in case they get both.
Yeah.
Liliana, I don't think it's as. I mean, Liliana Vale doesn't see vintage play anyway, but going to Legacy.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen it at. I don't even think the bug decks aren't running it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. It's a little different with that because Liliana Vale was already able to take advantage of second copies of Lily by +1ing and discarding that to the other one.
Yeah.
But I think a 3-1 split, or even 4 Liliana Vale and 1 Liliana Last Hope, I think is positive. Just
so greedy.
It gives us some more room to try different cards and possibly make more unique decks and more unique situations, and that's always a good thing.
I think it is a good thing. I'm sure Nick Fit will run like 4 different Garuks or something like that.
Yeah, probably.
A minute ago, we were talking about the idea of approaching that critical mass of good cards, and this is a small but maybe significant way to combat it. Is just like opening up more windows for you to get to play different cards. So,
well, yeah, and I think all of us as Eternal players, we're excited when a new card comes out in the new set, right? That we think might be playable. Like the single card discussions, whether on the Mana Drain, they're on the Source or whatever. Everyone loves them. Whether it's something that we think is playable or complete garbage, we like to talk about it. Like to see what we might be able to put in our decks. And we have all of these Eternal staples, but it's always fun to be evolving, right? Even though we're Eternal formats, we don't necessarily want to be stagnant. So there's a trade-off between that too, where you might start to get towards a threshold of what you can start adding to decks until it becomes EDH.
Yeah.
So the other component of the announcement here, the Ixalan spoilers are coming out now. Probably like 2 months ago, a lot of Ixalan was leaked in this like really blurry form. And now they're getting officially confirmed. Off the top of my head, the main one that matters, which we've touched on briefly, is Sorcerer's Spyglass.
Mm-hmm.
So could you just read it for me? Because I can't even remember what it does.
I don't have it pulled up, but
it's essentially like
correct me if I'm wrong here.
Some kind of pithing needle.
It's a 2-mana. Yeah, it's a 2-mana artifact. When it comes into play, you look at your opponent's hand, right?
Yep.
And then you can pick a card and name an ability, and that ability can't be activated if it's a non-mana.
Oh, is it if it's non-mana?
So that's what I thought it was.
Non-mana. So I think.
Oh yeah, it must be name lands. It must be.
Yeah, it's non-mana because the big thing people have been talking about is hitting fetches.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think
changes my opinion a little bit here. One of my potential talking points was being able to peek at their hand, see which Moxen they have, and shut it off. But you can't do that.
Well, so I think it's non-mana is maybe better in Legacy and worse in Vintage. In Legacy, being able to shut off just fetch lands is awesome.
Right.
Obviously, there's fewer shells that want something like this. You're looking at like Eldrazi, Stompy, and Mud, and anything with Ancient Tomb, basically.
I'll be playing.
Exactly. Patrick and I will be on it.
Yeah.
In Vintage, not being able to shut off Moxen is worse. Like, for instance, this is not like in any way is this a straight replacement for something like Revoker.
No.
In addition to being a body, it shuts off Moxen. But it's still, I think, potentially good. If you're playing against any blue deck, it's a great turn 1 play. Like, you could maybe shut off their fetch, you know what's in their hand. And if they're a blue deck that's playing something like, Time Vault or Dak Faden, like that's a very good play.
You can name any card, right? Not just what you see.
Yeah. You can name.
Yeah. So you can so in shops that feels really good just to hit fetches,
Yeah. So one other thing is, I think what makes it much better in Vintage than in Legacy. Well, I don't want to say it's much better in Vintage overall, but one thing that's a major advantage in Vintage is that 2 mana on turn 1 in Vintage is trivial, where it's tough in Legacy. So when you're talking a Shops deck, getting 2 mana on a Shops deck on turn 1 is, if you can't make 2 mana on turn 1, you should have mulliganed the hand. So if you can peek at their hand, see what types of lands, what types of fetches, what types of stuff they have, then shut off their fetches before they even get a chance to play it. They can't fetch in response or do anything stupid like that.
Yeah, no, I think it seems pretty solid. It's definitely going to see play. People are going to try it out. I think both in Vintage and in Legacy. We should see it a little bit. I think it'll be good.
Yeah, I think it's got potential. It's got a lot of potential.
Yeah, I don't know if it'll
cool
be
to see. Go ahead, Patrick.
I'm just not sure if it'll be like, you might see 2 of them. You know, probably 2, maybe 3 in some decks. But yeah,
I mean, so Wizards has caught some flack lately for not having strong answers available in formats like Standard. So I think we're seeing cards like this get printed specifically because of Standard. You know, it's easy as Eternal players to kind of put everything in that lens. I think it's probably existing there, but I think that it'll still get some play in these Eternal formats. I think specifically in decks that can generate 2 or more mana on turn 1, it's really good. I don't expect to see like a Delver deck playing this, but in Legacy, I think, you know, any stompy shell will probably be maybe interested in it. Bare minimum, I mean, it doesn't get caught by your own Chalice. So if you're playing a Chalice deck, you probably replace your needles with this.
Yeah, I think
other than that, I don't know. But it's cool to see this stuff moving forward. The other thing is, like, a lot of the new cards we've seen breaking into our formats are just power creeped creatures. So it's cool to see them putting out some stuff like this that are new tools for us that aren't, like, obviously just some stupid new broken card.
Yeah, I'm trying to think maybe besides like Paradoxical Outcome, what's coming.
That's the one that comes to mind. I mean, Delve.
Yeah.
Delve. And, like, you know, cards like Delve and Paradoxical are, like, basically design mistakes anyway. But this.
But we love them.
Like
we love them.
I just realized in a shop shell, 4 mana is not uncommon on turn 1 either. So, and you're running 4 Phyrexian Revoker. So you can imagine situations where you use the Spyglass to see what's in their hand, name a fetch land or some other relevant thing, and then slam your Revoker on the Mox that they have in their hand before they can even use it. That's pretty brutal. Because you're going to keep a hand that has, 2 polluted Deltas and a Mox and some spells, and if they shut off all of them before you even play, you just got wrecked.
Jesus, look, I mean, even in the mirror, it would be pretty decent.
Oh
yeah, it would be. It would be.
Outside of like
you can see, I have Ravagers. They have Ballistas. I can shut off Ballistas, and it seems like a relevant card.
Very much so.
Part of the reason that
they have a waste heavy hand, and you're short on mana, and
I mean, part of the reason that we both see new printings like this and that we get banned and restriction announcements is to keep us interested. And if you look at something like Spyglass and Shops, for all we know, it'll end up being super strong and be a problem down the road. But bare minimum, what this card is a new dimension of play that we haven't seen. In the past, it's been Shops has locked you out by just like slowly making all your spells cost too much mana. At least this is a new avenue for having a lock in Shops. So that's cool.
And Shops has never had an effect that peeks at your opponent's hand. And it's never really needed it. But sometimes it's nice because, those times when you're holding back casting a Lodestone Golem because you're waiting for them to tap out so that you can do it without, underneath a thorn to protect it. And if you just slam this thing on turn 1 and see they have no force of will, and then next turn you're just like, oh, cool, I'm free to just cast my Golem.
What, you're not running Glasses of Urza in Shops?
I forgot. Multi-format All-Star.
The problem with Glasses is that, like, your opponent's Revoker shut it off, so.
I want to run that.
Right.
Yeah.
Your opponent's Spyglasses you and Glasses of Urza, so you can't go back at them.
You should
classic vintage play.
Yeah. All right.
I think we're running out of steam here. This is becoming very, very useless to anyone listening. So signing off, I think all 3 of us are pretty much good with this announcement. I think as far as restrictions go, it's good. As far as unrestrictions go, it's good to great. As far as layout and communication, it's almost perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd give it an A overall.
So we'll see.
I would give them an A+ if they hit the right card in shops, but it's not like they hit the wrong card, obviously. So, but 100% agree with Mentor. 100% agree with Yawgmoth's bargain. I like the way they communicated it. It was good announcement. I'm happy about it.
So we'll see what happens. Next one is right before Eternal Weekend, which is maybe an event that matters to cast members more than it does to listeners. I think all of us really enjoy Eternal Weekend and try to go if we can. It's maybe less of a big deal than something like a GP, but we'll see what happens. Hopefully they keep good on their promise to handle that in a way that makes it easy for folks attending Eternal Weekend. So a couple quick announcements before we sign off here. On the weekend of, I think it's Saturday, September 9th. It's like the 8th or the 9th.
Right. Let me see.
We're going to be doing Lone Star Lurgoyf Vintage in Austin as opposed to Houston. It's going to be Saturday at Fourth Tap Brewing, which is a good local brewery. Emphasis being it's going to be slightly more money to entry. It's going to be something like 25 instead of 10, but all the money is going to go to charity. I think we're currently planning on donating to the Red Cross, and we're going to have an increased prize pool. Instead of cash payouts, we're going to have something like a volcanic island for first place. And
Hurricane.
I want to say, yeah, Sam is doing a great job with the prizes. He's got a Volk for first. I think it's a play set of Snapcaster Mages for second place.
And I think there's an Altered Lily.
Yeah, he's got an Altered Liliana of the Veil for third place. And I think we're going to have a Karn Liberated for fourth place. Just doing payouts top four because we don't have enough cards to give away. But that's what we're looking at. So we hope everyone comes out for it. Should be a good time. And Fourth Tap has good beers, and it's a Saturday afternoon, so we'll have plenty of time to play some vintage and then go out on Austin afterwards. So I hope everyone makes it out for that.
Is the brewery dog friendly?
I haven't confirmed that yet. I need to find that out. I don't know if I'll bring Bunk. Bunk tends to just stand around awkwardly and nervously while we play Magic, so I might.
I probably shouldn't bring the names. They tend to drool on tables, so that's not great for vintage cards.
No, but on that note, I should
proxy. You mentioned that. I can't remember.
No, I haven't mentioned that. Yeah, 100% proxy. We want anyone and everyone to come out. If you've never played vintage before, we're a friendly group. Come play vintage with us. All you need to own is some bulk and a printer, and money's going towards our good friends in Houston. So. Happy to come out. If you don't have a vintage deck, it's not a problem. Just hit one of those up on Twitter. I think at Texas Lurgoyfs is the Twitter, right? I think that's it.
Yeah. Proxy decks. I had like 3 or 4 proxy vintage decks in my bag last time I showed up. So
yeah, we'll bring extra decks for people, but do let us know ahead of time just so we can make sure we have enough for everyone. But everyone and all people are welcome. So we want as many new players. If you've played vintage before, this is a great time to come out and try it out.
If not, then you can play whatever you want and probably kick the shit out of us because we'll all be playing random jank as we normally do.
Yeah.
Bring standard deck. Bring standard. And you'll probably do okay.
Oh, and usually a few of us have old school on us as well for between rounds and after. So
yeah, for sure. I need to get some practice in. So
yeah.
So that's what we have coming up. Do you guys have any other events you want to shout out? I can't think of anything.
No.
Asgard's going to be doing a charity tournament for
that's right.
Yeah.
In the Houston flood relief, I think. I'm not sure exactly what the plan is. They had been doing it, or they had one plan for this last Saturday. They got flooded out. That was to give away an Underground Sea as a prize. That was just a regular tournament. I'd heard they were going to give away a whole bunch of random flood-related
polluted delta, bayous,
flooded strands. Yeah, I heard they're going to give them away as door prizes and stuff. So I don't think
water damaged.
A date on that.
We'll put up information. Yeah.
Find out exactly when it is.
Yeah,
I don't think they can. The city won't be underwater again.
I had planned to come up for the Underground Sea event, but the flood happened. So if that's on a weekend I could do, I'll be there in a heartbeat. I like playing at Asgard. So, you guys got anything?
Hold on. They have it tagged as September 2nd.
That's ambitious.
Looks like it is a little ambitious. Oh, this is just the rescheduling of the Underground Sea tournament. So there's an Underground Sea tournament at what's it called?
At Asgard?
Asgard this Saturday. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, we'll see if they follow through with
Great
that.
Legacy.
Yeah. That may be rescheduled. We'll
100%
see.
of prizes plus the dual land. So they've been doing this series. So it's been great.
Cool.
So you guys got anything coming up? We have Labor Day weekend this weekend. Anything going on?
Probably hoping my house doesn't flood.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, stay dry, guys, and
Yep.
All right.
it seems like you're getting maybe getting over the worst of it now. I guess there's some questions about levees and dams, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Still a lot to come, but I think, yeah, it's still evolving. We'll see how it goes, but hopefully everyone in Houston stays safe and stays dry. But it's been good. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, I thought this was a good cast. I'm glad you guys could have your priorities straight for doing it. So,
thanks, Stu.
Yeah, thanks for coming on today, guys, and it'll be good to play some vintage moving forward.
Definitely.
See you guys.